Hello, everyone, and welcome to this last panel, the panel 1 on consumption, which we've oriented this year with my colleague Marta Lopez around conceptions of well-being in relation to energy usage. Really delighted today to have 4 presenters with us. We're going to end on a topic that broadly talks on the relation between energy, well-being, and stories, societal trends, normative dimensions of energy usage. But before we get started, I wanted to extend a very warm thank you to Liz Warren. Liz, who without her, we would not be able to manage these Zoom sessions. So thank you so much, Liz. It's been very so useful to have you, helpful for us as panel co-leaders. Thanks so much for all of your support. So without further ado, we'll get started right away with Aurore Flippo, and I believe that Nathalie Hortard is also with us and might be joining us here in the webinar. So Aurore, you have 15 minutes, the floor is yours, and she'll be presenting a study called Between Bottom-Up and Top-Down Initiatives, the Path to Sustainable Mobility in Rural France.
Okay, thank you. I believe I sent a video, so is it supposed to run?
Yes, bear with me. I confess I was busy typing in the chat, so just give me 2 seconds and I will start your video for you. Sorry.
I was just wondering if I was supposed to present
after all
now.
The thanks. Hold on 1 second.
Thank you.
Nathalie is with us also. That's great. Welcome, Nathalie.
Thank you. Welcome. Thank you to you.
Hello, my name is Aurore Flippo. I'm a sociologist and I will present today some of the results of an ongoing research on the challenges of sustainable mobility in rural areas in France. Local mobility issues are determinant factors in territorial inequalities, regional development, and ecological transition. While urbanization has led to a growing concentrations of goods and services in the urban areas, rural and sparsely populated areas have been increasingly car-dependent in a system that has been progressively planned around individual motorized mobility. This state of affairs causes many ecological, social, and economic concerns. This paper intends to shed light on several grassroots initiatives on sustainable mobility that have appeared in France in rural areas, along with the emergence of car alternative experimentation encouraged by national funding schemes and agencies and by local advocacy networks. Our objective is to question how the issue of sustainable mobility is discussed, transformed, and negotiated by multiple stakeholders at the local level. How do local civil society organizations participate in this complex interplay? And what are the possible implications of the transition towards sustainable mobility in rural areas in terms of social justice? The paper is based on preliminary findings of qualitative socio-anthropological fieldwork carried out in 2 rural departments of Drôme and Ardèche. The data has been gathered within an action research project carried out in partnership with 2 local non-profit organizations, ALEC07 and Dromolib, whose aim is to help municipalities to develop sustainable mobility initiatives locally, 2 NGOs who advocate for energy transitions, Institut Negawatt and the CLAIRE Energy Transition Network, and 5 local intermunicipalities. Our project draws on the collaboration between these different partners to generate feedback and identify shared levers for implementing mobility strategies at the local level. The 2 areas in which we carried out our investigation, Southern Ardèche and the Drôme Valley, have a low population density and are characterized by the absence of any conurbation. The Drôme Valley's geography is marked by a central corridor, the valley, that is more densely populated, especially in the west, and a mountainous hinterland. Over the last few years, civil mobilization have focused on keeping local public service running with a specific focus on the railway line. In addition, this territory has been marking its ambition to be a leader in organic farming. This effort is supported by an economic and citizen-based ecosystem that is particularly mobilized around the challenges of ecological transition. The second fieldwork, located in southern Ardèche, is also very sparsely populated, more mountainous and deprived of public transportation. There are long distances between service centers, and in the summer, the high number of tourists visiting the area causes problems of traffic and congestion. Concerning grassroots initiative, we note that Southern Ardèche has a political culture strongly based on activism that showed its potential for mobilization in the fight against the development of the shale gas industry in the year 2010 and is still active in the energy transition sector. The concept of energy justice helps us understand how the transition toward a low-carbon society may, advertently or inadvertently, create or entrench unfairness within society. The concept of mobility justice, coined by Mimi Scheller, is in line with this approach of energy justice. Though disconnected from environmental issue, the concept of mobility justice allows us to enlighten how social justice is linked with spatial justice in energy transitions. Indeed, recent research on sustainable mobility in rural areas has particularly focused on the benchmarking and evaluation of social or technical innovation, the potential challenges linked with their implementation in low-dense areas, and on the individual determinants of transportation choices. The role of stakeholders have received far less attention. We argue, however, that investigating how the matter of local mobility is discussed and governed locally gives us the opportunity to study issues of justice with a pragmatic point of view. We also build an advocacy coalition framework in order to question how stakeholder practices and values underpin local action, putting light on the importance of systems of meaning and belief in public action. Finally, we follow Sophie Van Nest by defining stakeholder in transition towards sustainable mobility as taking part in the process of working collectively to promote alternatives to the private car. In order to do so, we have conducted 45 interviews with local elected officials, local mobility project officers, state, departmental and regional mobility officers, civil society organizations, and public transportation operators. We have also based our analysis on ethnography of the decision-making process and debates that we have observed in various steering committees. Concerning the focus of grassroots initiatives we found on our fieldwork, we note that bicycle is the main driver in both the Drôme Valley and the Southern Ardèche. These are mainly associative bike workshop and local advocacy in favor of bicycle use, electric bike rental services run by intermunicipalities, Véloroutians, delivery by bike, and a cycling school for adults. Public authorities have also been involved in planning and infrastructure with diverse projects of cycle lane extension, which are now still in the study phase. Civil society organizations have emerged from organized bicycle users concerned with safety issues and the lack of appropriate infrastructure for cycling, similarly to what we observed in urban contexts. They advocate for shared use of the road and the development of adequate equipment and intermodality, for example, to improve the payload capacity for bikes in trains and buses. However, what differs from the urban context is the importance of another lobby around bicycle use that is defending leisure and tourism, such as cycling clubs. There are different stakeholders that do not always share common views, as we will discuss further later on in the presentation. Very localized car-sharing initiatives are also present, which are mainly citizen-based and informal. Carpooling areas have been implemented by the department, and a larger-scale experimentation on secure hitchhiking is driven by an intermunicipality and currently under development. Regarding public transportation, the initiative relates mainly to advocacy for the maintenance of the train line in Rome and for the reopening of a railway service in Ardèche. In addition, we find in Ardèche the only public bus network around the small city of Aubenas. Finally, 2 demand-responsive transport services have been found and are run by social centers. This highlights the fact that historically, The issue of daily mobility in rural area was mainly taken care of by social support services who were seeking to offer mobility services for the most precarious people who did not access a car. Regarding the status of the actors involved, we note that if intermunicipalities are rather invested, especially regarding support for local experiments and planning, few municipalities are involved in mobility projects. Those that are mostly the bigger towns that can have urbanism and mobility services of their own. In addition to local public authorities, there are multiple competent institutional stakeholders on mobility. The department that is responsible for the maintenance of the roads, the region competent on public transportation, the national railway company that are themselves divided into several services or even separate branches. State agencies and European programs are also important stakeholders since they participate in the funding and monitoring of many initiatives. Now, if we look at the geographical spread of initiatives, we see two things. First, initiatives in the Jom Valley are more numerous and more structured, and it seems to be linked with the fact that the defense of the railway has framed mobility as a political local issue and has helped create a network of actors. Second, initiatives are to be found mostly in the centralities and close to other equipments, such as the railway station or cycle lanes. It does seem that the very presence of some mobility service or infrastructure triggers the dissemination of similar initiatives around. However, this virtuous circle is likely to leave apart the peripheral areas that are already the most deprived. One of the first results of our study is the complexity and overlapping of public bodies in the governance of local mobility in rural areas. The multiplicity of actors involved in local policymaking makes decision and implementation processes very complicated and potentially conflicting. Indeed, all stakeholders do not pursue the same goals, nor do they share the same agenda, including amongst the public institutions themselves. For example, we have witnessed the resistance of regional authorities, in this case the Auvergne-Rhône-Alpes region, to the willingness of intermunicipalities to participate in the local mobility governance system. The intermunicipalities, on the other hand, have been trying to have a voice in this centralized management and to legitimize the action they have been deploying in the past few years. The central state has been encouraging intermunicipalities to innovate and experiment, but has not been deploying sustainable funding to allow intermunicipalities to free themselves from regional funds. At the level of municipalities and intermunicipalities, conflicts can also exist between different services. Indeed, due to the lack of resources dedicated especially to mobility, it is mainly through other competencies that experiments have been led. The fact that mobility projects are often scattered across diverse competencies and services is paradoxical. On one hand, it makes it difficult to legitimize and implement a consistent mobility policy and to put it forward in the political agenda. But on the other hand, it allows local actors to develop strategies to circumvent the underfunding of mobility policy through using other sources of funding, such as tourism or sports, that are less controversial. Finally, local NGOs have been reclaiming more accountability from local elected officials, while the complexity of the governance system makes it very difficult for civil society organizations to have a real impact in the decision-making process. However, our research has also revealed the central role of some local civil society organizations that are developing alternatives to the car. These actors, which have been established for several years, have developed a real expertise on sustainable mobility and supported various projects that foster innovation. Being highly professionalized, they have provided the human resources lacking in public institutions for engineering, and because they are not bound politically, they have more agency than local elected officials to implement policy in the long term and across territorial borders. Those expert organizations are central in the network of actors. Though they don't have any decision power of their own in policymaking, their knowledge of the network make them influential and resourceful for local public actors. We have also noticed a certain ambivalence with respect to the role of ordinary citizens in the mobility system. On one hand, citizens are most of the time absent from the decision-making processes related to mobility planning, but on the other hand, almost all stakeholders have described ordinary citizens as a crucial scale of action. This invocation of the individual responsibility, however, frequently appears as a substitute for the impossibility of funding a public service, especially in the less populated areas. To conclude briefly, the study of rural mobility and energy transition have highlighted the need to question more specifically the territorial dimensions of energy justice. The scarcity of funding sometimes leads civil society organizations to enter in competition with each other for public support. Sustainable mobility solutions are often expensive and can't be profitable in the context of low density. There is thus a need to provide funding solutions so that initiatives can spread rather than compete with each other. As there is still much difficulty to meet the transportation needs of the rural population, attention should be drawn to how the citizen empowerment argument is used to mitigate the impossibility of offering a public service due to a lack of funding and engineering, and especially in the more peripheral areas. I thank you for your attention and I welcome your question. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Aurore and Nathalie. Such a lovely study that you've conducted in these two regions of France. So we have questions that I guess will be coming in soon over WUVA, and also our co-panelists. Feel free to ask questions. It's sort of it's in a way a sad story, in the sense that on the one hand you want to be happy that civil society is trying to propose initiatives. On the other hand, you don't want to over responsibilize civil society when there aren't enough resources and the public sector is sort of squabbling amongst themselves and is unable to step in to offer real support. I thought that was an interesting point of tension, and also the fact that it's not only resources in terms of money, but time, the human resources of these public officials to engage. So Katerina is saying, thank you for your interesting presentation. How big is the electric car market in France? Is there electrification initiatives that might be taking off? You spoke mostly about the bicycle, but what about electric car charger infrastructure? Is that at all on the radar in these regions?
Oh, okay. So about electrification, so we are in very rural areas. That means that the travel is quite high. So electrification is, the range of electric car is not necessarily quite adequate. This is one reason. The other is that those areas are populated with a population that's not always very rich. So there is also the question of the wellness of the population, which makes that electrification in France is still expensive, electric car expensive. So this is an issue why this is not so much developed. And the last reason is that the state is not really ready, despite its many discourses. So, but Aurore has some examples of electrifications that we have seen in the initiatives.
Yes, electric cars are mainly shared cars for now, rather than individual cars. So there were some initiatives of sharing electric car, for example, for a small group of houses, or there is another experimentation like cities, which is a service that is in the cities, but that doesn't go to the rural areas because they are scared that they won't be profitable. So there is an public institution, intermunicipality, that is running its own experimentation with 4 electric cars to be shared.
Tina Fawcett is asking, can you give a couple of examples of these civil society organizations who are so important? What do they look like and how do they keep going if mostly based on volunteer time? And if I could add to that, are they aware of these sort of tensions with public authorities, or what is their relationship to the public authorities?
Well, the expert, I believe Tina is referring to the expert civil society organization that we said were crucial for human resources. So I have to say that they are our partners in the research. So that's through them that we were able to access the network. And why they are important, especially because they are central in the network. They are providing some advice and some ready-to-go solutions, if I may say. And they are professionalized. That means they are not based on volunteers. They have a civil society organization status, but they more look like, in the way they function, they are closer to a bureau d'études. I don't know how to say that.
Like agencies, like
Yes.
yeah, that provide a service and that they pay themselves for that service. A last quick question here. We have 1 more minute from Katie Janda. Can you talk a bit about your conceptualization of stakeholders in terms of how they are or not intermediaries or middle actors? And she says the discussion of agency and expertise seems similar to the change from the middle out frame. I'm not sure about that last bit, but maybe just because I'm not sure I understand it myself, but maybe just, are they intermediaries between citizens who are looking for solutions and maybe public sector actors that aren't able to provide these solutions? And there is a conceptualization of intermediaries that could be perhaps useful to your study. What do you think?
Do you want to answer, Nathalie?
Yes, I think it's a very good suggestion, and we have so far put in the stakeholders, the association and the NGOs at the same level, but and civil initiatives, citizen initiatives at the same level. But yes, you're probably right that they might sometimes, and sometimes they might not be intermediaries. But what is sure, yes, is that they are providing an expert knowledge to citizens and to the municipalities. So they have this in-between position.
Great. Okay. Thank you so much then to the both of you for this talk and to the questions. I'm sure there'll be other questions coming up on WUVA. So now I turn over the floor to Janine, who's going to talk to us about clothing, comfort, and energy demand.
Janine Morley, and I'm a early career research fellow at Lancaster University. And I'm working on a small project funded by CREDS, the Centre for Research into Energy Demand Solutions, based in the UK, which aims to raise debate about clothing and its contribution to energy demand reduction as part of the decarbonisation of space heating. And this talk is based on a literature review that I'm conducting as part of that project into how clothing has been discussed within energy literatures. And I'm going to argue that clothing has actually been overlooked, especially within social scientific research, and that at least part of the reason for this may be because of a narrow conceptualization of this relationship between clothing and comfort. But first, let me say a few words about why clothing is important to energy research and policy. My interest in the topic goes back to my PhD. So over 10 years ago, I found that there were significant differences in how students in halls of residence were dressing. And that this was reflected in how warm or cool they liked to have their rooms. And these differences prompted me to look back at the history of clothing, and I found a trend towards casualisation and to lighter clothing, such that the default styles of dress that are available to us to wear today offer much less year-round in terms of insulation than they did in the past. And I argued that this was significant for energy demand because we know that clothing is part of the thermal comfort equation. Scientifically, as Fanger's equation tells us, the more clothing insulation that a person wears, the more likely they are to feel comfortable at a lower temperature. And we also know how significant heating and cooling is in terms of its energy consumption. For UK homes, it's about 2/3 of energy use in total. And in terms of carbon emissions, that's about 16 to 18% in the UK for all space and heating and cooling of within territory carbon emissions. And so lower indoor temperatures during the winter would help to reduce this carbon emissions and energy demand. And by some estimates, this could be around 10% or more for every 1 degree of reduction in thermostat settings. And indeed, it is a common and enduring piece of energy advice to turn that thermostat down. But there is actually no formal policy, as far as I'm aware, that would support this, certainly within the UK, that would enable lower winter temperatures indoors. And in fact, evidence suggests that the opposite is happening, that average room temperatures have increased over the last few decades and may continue to do so with improvements in insulation and the transition towards heat pumps. And so some researchers have called for much greater attention to be paid to the escalating conventions of comfort. In quite an influential paper over 15 years ago, Chapples and Shove argued that comfort is a provisional and always precarious social and cultural achievement. And so it was important to debate and challenge conventions of comfort and not simply assume that any changes represent something that is more genuinely or innately comfortable. And I've included a large quote here because it really highlights how clothing is situated within these conventions of comfort. They suggest that people could become conditioned to a much wider variety of temperatures, such that they were lower in winter and warmer than they are currently in summer. And that if this were the case, seasonal fashions might provide an important means of managing such climatic variation. Clothing, combined with a much more elastic definition of comfort, could significantly reduce energy demand. And given these arguments, we might expect that clothing would actually be a core topic for research within social science energy research. And actually we would expect potentially that interest in clothing could have grown over the years as the interest has increased around energy sufficiency, which highlights the importance of services and the contributions of actually non-energy using facets such as clothing. For instance, Darby highlights the qualities of services such as acceptable temperatures. Also, research has highlighted the success of the Japanese policy of cool biz, and as pace gathers around retrofit programs and the installation of heat pumps, particularly as it is in the UK, there are both risks here and opportunities, both that temperatures would creep up, but also opportunities to embrace a change in how comfort is understood and delivered and achieved. So I'm conducting a literature review into how clothing has actually featured so far within energy research. And I'm focusing on social science research because I think this is the most likely genre to actually recognise this sociocultural status of comfort and the significance of clothing within it. The review is still ongoing, and I'm going to present just some of the results today, which present a manageable chunk for me to talk about, but also a useful insight into the social sciences with energy research. So I've principally looking at the journal Energy Research and Social Science, which began in 2014. And indeed, a search for clothes or clothing returns over 200 articles. Looking at the 75 most relevant within the search ranking, a third of those are discussing comfort, but other topics come up, such as laundry and general consumption issues around the purchase and the embodied energy within clothing. But most of these are actually passing mentions. There is very little detailed discussion of clothing and its relationship to comfort. And where it is significant enough to feature within the title, there are only 3 papers that are actually related. So within the title, abstract or keyword, there are only 3 papers related to comfort. And these are listed in the left-hand column of this table. As you can see, none of these are directly about clothing and its relation to space heating or cooling. And if we add a similar review for eceee, we actually find 24 papers since in the 15 years that the summer study has run. And most of these are about laundry, actually. There's only 2 or 3 which relate their discussion of clothing to heating, cooling, or comfort. One of them is actually directly interested in the topic, and it's a poster. So this is Poscanza dressing for the Anthropocene. It's a really interesting poster. So, but across these 2 venues then, there is actually no full article that specifically addresses the connections between clothing, comfort, and energy demand in any detailed way. So it's not a major topic of research, but in what context does this relationship crop up and how is it conceptualized? To look into this, I analysed a smaller subset of these papers, and I discerned 3 main frames, which are not mutually exclusive. There is overlap between them, but I think they are distinct. The first and most common is an interest in adjustments to clothing as a response to discomfort, as an adaptive response, which is informed by adaptive comfort theory. This is where changes in clothing levels can actually be used as a measure to tell us about when people are uncomfortable with the ambient conditions. And also that this commonly talked about as one of a number of adaptive opportunities that occupants have within buildings to stay comfortable, and interest around is there in terms of contrasting perhaps personal adjustments like clothing or interactions with aspects of the building systems such as the windows or the thermostats. Secondly, and similar to this, is an interest in adjustments to clothing that are made specifically as an alternative to heating. So where clothes are used instead of heating, perhaps either as a measure of energy saving, specifically to save energy, or out of necessity, where the affordability of the fuel is at stake, or the performance of the heating and cooling systems are not as we might want them to be. But also where clothes are used instead of heating out of choice or preference. So this is usually in a condition where, in a context where there is a normative slant to this alternative. Thirdly, and least common, is where clothing crops up as part of social and cultural ways of understanding and being comfortable, where it is acknowledged as a culturally and historically specific phenomena. For example, Wolf and colleagues emphasize the historical emphasis that has been placed on keeping the body warm rather than heating indoor spaces, that still prevails in some countries. They point to Portugal. Hampton also notes how clothing is embedded within practices in the workplace where it helps to embody authority, and how this is different when people are working at home, which has implications for energy demand. But these acknowledgements to the wider social life of clothing and the meanings of comfort are rare, even within this social science journal. And I suggest that it is these more dominant framings are narrow and perhaps actually contribute to undermining the wider importance of clothing within specifying and contributing towards the demand for space heating and cooling. Firstly, I would suggest that the focus on adjustments to clothing levels is limited to particular times and places. And they fails to interrogate what the baseline is. You know, what are people wearing in the first place, and what extra clothes do they have? Are those adjustments effective? Do certain styles of dress actually prohibit such adjustments? And how have all these options and preferences been shaped in the first place? So whether just people are adjusting their clothes in a given context is just a scratch on the surface of the significance of clothing. Secondly, by defining clothing as part of an adaptation, there's a potential narrowing in its conceptualization. Not only because an adaptation implies not only this modification from a prior version, but also this sense of about fitting to environmental conditions like climate. And inherent in there is the assumption that this works one way, that how we dress is adapted to the climate, perhaps in a given context or even geographically speaking, which is fine. But when we have control of climates, as we do with indoor climates, they can be adapted to suit how we dress and the kinds of clothes that are available, desirable and fashionable. And so it is an iterative and evolving relationship between clothing and acceptable temperatures, which points to the need for a much richer, longer term and broader perspective on clothing than is currently prevalent. Nevertheless, there are some interesting insights to be taken from the research that does exist. And overall, what strikes me is that there is no settled agreement about the role of clothing within comfort, particularly at home. So for some, the idea of wearing extra clothes in order to keep warm is really not attractive. And in fact, the expression of having to wear extra clothes is often used as a definition of having to put up with uncomfortable conditions. And equally, the freedom of not having to wear extra clothes can be used to define a comfortable home. But to others, wearing warm clothing and using textiles such as blankets is just normal, sensible, or even attractive and a satisfying thing to do. For instance, for those working at home in Hampton's study. And for those in fuel poverty, the research suggests they can fall into either category. That for some groups, wearing this kind of extra clothing, this additional clothing to whatever is normal, is stigmatizing, particularly for older people. Yet for others, it's just part of a normal way of keeping warm and only matters if it works or not. So this conceptualization of extra versus otherwise normal clothing is commonplace and quite important. And it actually would be a good starting point for widening further research into the topic. And there are many more research questions that we could frame to explore this wider significance of clothing. This could include case studies, the development of methods to better assess levels of clothing, which would help us understand the varieties of what people wear and how it relates to observed variations in indoor climates across different social and age groups. Investigations into how fashions and systems of provision shape trends and these concepts of what is normal or additional or extra clothes, and actually how sustainable fashion and the research in that might start to engage with the thermal properties of clothing and its implications for energy demand. There's scope for ethnographies to develop detailed and thicker understanding of what works for people in different genders and age groups, and how they interact potentially with lower carbon heating systems. And no doubt there is much, much more to explore. But I'm open to collaboration, and if you're interested in any of this, please do get in touch. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Janine. Of course, very interesting topic for me personally, since I have been looking a little bit at clothing and heating, but also cooling in Asia. So we open the floor to any questions. I see here in the chat from Niels Borg, my colleague Jason Irwin wrote a paper for EDEL a few years ago, not from a societal point of view, but rather a review of the different technologies and solutions, and the basic concept is the same: save energy by more adequate clothing. It's true that coming out of the Energize project, which focused on heating and laundry, we really had this message of cooling or heating people and not spaces. And when you think about people, you get closer to clothing. And I know that Grégoire Wallenborn and Harold Wilhite recently, unfortunately deceased, of, someone who we appreciated very much here at the eceee, wrote a paper on layers and layering, and how buildings have layers, but people also have layers when it comes to sort of insulating the body. So maybe there's some pistes, as we say in French, some inroads for you. Here's one from a question now from Katerina Rendell. Thank you for such an interesting topic. Do you have any ideas, suggestions? How do we actually change out of perception or relation to clothing? How do we change fashion trends to wear more clothes inside again and not be in t-shirts throughout the winter?
I think that's a really interesting question as to actually how fashion has gone in the direction of t-shirts and lighter clothes. And I think the history of that is something that's really worth digging into. And in some sense, when I was looking at this for my PhD, one of the things that really stood out for me was the role of Hollywood, as it were. So the trends really started taking hold at the start of the 20th century. And Hollywood you can imagine where Hollywood is, this kind of internationalization of a Californian kind of climate, and the glamorousness of wearing lighter clothes, as was possible perhaps year round in some places like California, had an influence, perhaps started to have an influence internationally. And I think that holds true today. So I think influencers on social media still have a role, and they're international. They may well be based in very different climates, and that sort of seasonal sensitivity, I think, as part of our international fashion scene, has probably been lost to a large degree. So I think seasonality is a very key theme that fashion could really re-engage with, and would be positive for the fashion industry to do so, because obviously they're interested in seasons. There are fashion seasons which the retailers will launch a new range and so forth. So actually developing a much sort of a deeper sense of seasonality within specific countries would potentially work in that direction.
The problem is these fashion seasons of the West, they influence the South as well. So people in the Philippines want to be fashionable, the elites, and they end up cranking up the aircon to be able to wear the woolen jersey. There are a bunch of questions coming in. Let's see. Aurore was asking, do you think it would be interesting to study children and clothing? Because children seem to have very specific ideas or feelings about not only the warmth, but the weight of clothes and the look. Marta is commenting on, in Portugal, buildings are not sufficiently warm to be in t-shirts all year round. So that's an interesting case. I'll just give you 2 or 3 questions, and then you can answer the one you like in the last minute or so. Tina Fawcett, do you have any thoughts on why this topic is so understudied? My first thought is how politically toxic it would be to suggest people to just put on a jumper. This is something that Carter recommended, I believe, in the US during the oil crisis. And Matt Malinovsky says, thank you. Did you look beyond European research papers? Because it's been a big topic in other cultures. Here again, Jimmy Carter's sweater speech, cool biz in Japan, seasonal overcooling in commercial buildings in the US, and the need to wear sweaters while 30 degrees outside. Absolutely. And then the gendered impact of business wear. Yeah, thank you. So you can answer those, Janine, I guess, and then the clock is ticking, unfortunately. So if you could just answer them in a grouped fashion, that would be great.
Okay, I'll try my best. Yes, I mean, at the moment, there is obviously a lot more research that I'm covering that is not actually included in the talk today, because I really just focused on what has cropped up within energy research and social science over the, since it started. There's more, so that's a very slight view, I suppose. But yeah, and yes, cool biz is obviously very, very significant within that. And you mentioned Jimmy Carter's sweater speech. Well, in the UK, there is other examples of how toxic that can be. Edwina Currie, David Cameron have both fallen foul of trying to give fashion advice in very insensitive ways. I don't think it needs to be led by politicians in that sense. I don't think that's necessarily helpful. And I think an understanding of actually how given those histories of interventions potentially around sweaters, I think it would be useful to understand how the toxicity of putting on an extra jumper as a step towards policy is actually being framed. How that has happened and how it persists across a wider range of policy making. So I think that's a piece of research actually in there to do that. And on the topic of clothing for children, yes, I'm really interested in that, particularly school children. And obviously schools are very different kind of environments, and school children wear uniforms, which are very often, they can be, certainly secondary school level in the UK, can be very unseasonal. You wear the same clothes like year round, and there's very little within the uniform wardrobe to actually adapt. So I think that's a really interesting topic actually for future research, to look at thermal comfort clothing for children.
Great. Thank you so much, Janine. So there's much more here to discuss and think about and talk about. We're now going to move on to the third presentation. Nadezhda Mikova, who's in Berlin currently, is going to talk to us about understanding the controversial impact of new societal trends on long-term energy demand in European countries.
Yes, hello once again. My name is Nadezhda Mikova. I am a research fellow at Fraunhofer Institute for Systems and Innovation Research. And my presentation today is about understanding the controversial impact of new societal trends on energy demand in the European countries. So this research has been done under the New Trends project supported by the European Commission and carried out in partnership with several research institutes. You can see them below. So Fraunhofer Institute is a coordinator of this project. So I suggest we start with a general description of the project, then go to the definition and examples of the new societal trends. Then I will describe the general methodology of our research in terms of main steps, methods, and results obtained. Then we will discuss the results of 3 expert workshops that we organized in order to assess the impact of new societal trends on energy demand. And we will go to the open room for further research in this direction. The New Trends project aims at developing and developing the analytical basis for the energy efficiency vision 2050, taking into account the new societal trends that may significantly impact the energy consumption in the European countries. So the tasks are to increase the understanding, to improve the modeling, and to explore the future impact of such trends. We understand new societal trends in our project as arising trends that are related to general megatrends and that can have potentially significant impacts on energy consumption in long term. So they can increase energy consumption, decrease energy consumption, or shift it from one sector to another. And the examples of such trends may include digitalization of economy or private life, shared economy, transition from consumers to prosumers, and also circular economy and material efficiency and other trends. So here you can see the methodology of our research. So this research has been done in 3 consecutive steps. So first we selected energy relevant new societal trends based on analysis of previous foresight studies and long-term energy demand scenarios. Then we organized 3 expert workshops in order to cluster these trends and assess their potential impact. And finally, we developed the narratives for final new societal trans clusters to describe the potential mechanisms of their controversial impact on future energy demand in the European countries. So in our research, we used such methods as literature review, qualitative clustering, impact assessment, cluster prioritization, as well as network analysis in order to understand the relationships between societal trends. So in workshop 1, we did the trend clustering with our project partners. In workshop 2, we did cluster analysis and prioritization with external experts. And in workshop 3, we carried out the final cluster analysis and prioritized these final clusters with our project partners. So here you can see the results of workshop 1, initial review and horizon scanning. So we gathered energy relevant trends based on the desk research of the previous foresight studies and long-term low carbon strategies of different European countries. And here you can see that these trends are divided into 3 categories: social, economic, and political. And then experts were asked to create the clusters from these trends. So as a result, we had 20 clusters with interlinkages between them. And then the experts were divided into several work groups, and we asked them to assess the impact of these trends on future energy demand. Using 3-dimensional metrics. So first of all, we assessed the degree of impact. It could be low, medium, or high. Then we also assessed the scale of impact, macro, meso, or micro level, and the direction of impact. If this trend increases energy demand, decreases energy demand, or shifts the energy consumption from one sector to another sector. Additionally, we asked the experts to select 2 or 3 disruptive trends in each group. And after that, these clusters were prioritized by expert voting. So at the end, we had 10 priority clusters. You can see them here. Then we used this information for the review of trends narratives and for final prioritization. So as a result of the 3rd workshop, 15 final clusters were developed, and they were divided into 4 groups: universal clusters, nice to have clusters, optional, and the clusters for future research. For example, the category universal includes digitalization, sustainable cities, green transition, decentralized work, sharing economy, climate change and behavior, as well as circular economy. So this category is the most important in terms of further implementing into modeling. So in this study, we analyzed new societal trends, and as a result, we had the set of these trends in order to integrate them into energy demand models. But we faced the problem that some trends were too general, too abstract to effectively approach for modeling research. So there was a little concrete information about how these clusters are interconnected. And we decided to do a preliminary analysis of interrelationships between these clusters. This additional layer of information could be then used to focus the further development of demand models. So in this study, we analyze interrelationships between these clusters influencing future energy demand, and used network analysis, only like the visualization method. And we kind of try to analyze the connections between clusters. For example, cluster A is connected with cluster B through the underlying trends. For example, here, rebound effect cluster is connected with climate change and behavior through 4 trends like education and training options, citizen perceptions of environmental impacts of behaviors, slow consumption, as well as a new culture of exchange becoming established. So here, for example, we could attempt to model the impact of increased education and awareness raising campaigns based on national and regional level funding for programs targeting sustainability focused learning and messaging. And as an option, we also could quantify the new models of exchange in this direction. And here, analyzing these connections, we also can see how important is, for example, the role of the individual and the community conditions. So we go to the idea that we need to change the human behavior, first of all, maybe not changing the underlying systems. So we created the table of interrelationships between trend clusters. You can see 20 clusters here vertically and 20 clusters here horizontally. And we can see how many trends they have in common. For example, sustainable cities and urbanization have 8 trends in common, or for example, migration displacement and Great Depression have 5 trends in common. And then based on this information and the strength of connections between these clusters, we created just a visualization of these interrelationships. So we can see that some clusters are strongly connected in this picture, and some clusters, the connections between them are not that strong. I must know that this is just the first attempt to see the general picture of the relationships between trend clusters, and at the next stages of analysis, we are going to go deeper into details in this regard, and to do more detailed analysis of such connections. So the analysis has shown that the resulting clusters and their underlying trends have controversial impacts on energy consumption in long term, and they can at the same time decrease, increase, and shift energy demand from one to other sector. And therefore, they should be analyzed more in detail to assess their final contribution to the energy transition. And such interesting aspects like disruptiveness of these new societal trends, sufficiency and behavioral changes, uncertainties and risks, as well as cross-impact, cross-sectoral analysis could be very helpful and interesting in this regard. To do in the future. Also, energy policy implications should be taken into account to understand the complete picture of their influence, and to understand what concrete policy measures are needed in order to make this energy transition more effective. So thank you for your attention. Here you can find the link to our project. So if you want to get some detailed information about it, or to see interesting presentations that are presented there, so please go to this link. And if you have any questions, let me know.
Great, thank you so much, Nadezhda. Thank you. So I guess while questions are coming in, I find your process very interesting. How you try to engage different people in these working groups. But this conclusion that you come to, that we need more information, we need behavior change, this is something that's often contested as not being sufficient, but it is the easy solution. I mean, you put 10 people in a room and you ask them how to engage in the energy transition, they'll say, let's make a information campaign. Do you have a more critical view perhaps on that finding, or how do you feel about this prescription of behavioral change and more information?
Actually, the task for us was to analyze what trends may impact energy consumption in different areas, and then to give this information, to provide with this information our colleagues on the next stages of analysis. When we go to the modeling, we need to take into account all the trends and connections between them, and like the main goal was to provide them with a complete picture of all the clusters and underlying trends that may influence energy consumption. And then at the next stages, these narratives that were developed by the experts, they will be quantified somehow in the models, and this will be like the additional information for taking into account. So the main goal was the list of the clusters and the trends that we have, like the basis for the next steps. Yes, and then the expert will quantify some assumptions and narratives at the next stages.
Okay, all right. Maybe I'm just waiting for questions to come in, but another one for me, I guess in panel 1 on Monday and Tuesday, we spoke a lot about the need to think about change more at the level of infrastructures, community level change. Did that come up at all in terms of changing systems of provision, for example? Did that come up in any of your results? Or not so much, like not just changing people, but changing the context in which they consume energy?
Yes, sure. There are anyway. There are two directions, maybe more to encourage people, maybe to consume less or to contribute to energy transition. So you may somehow try to take into account behavior patterns and influence people's consumption, and then you can also so like conditions that in what people can't behave in another way. So it's like, I think it's a kind of bottom up and like approach from the like anyway, in balance it should go like in two directions, from the top and from the bottom, and then in order to see the kind of a gold.
Great. Okay. Thank you. Thanks so much. Any other questions? If not, I'm sure there will be questions on WUVA that you can check later in the panel discussion. And otherwise, if there are no further questions, I will turn the floor over now to Noam and Katie, our last but not least, I guess, right? Presenters in this panel 1 today. They will present on recasting stories about energy in a post-pandemic world. We're looking forward to hearing you.
Hi, I'm Noam.
And I'm Katie.
And we want to tell you a story today. So we are both interested in stories and narratives about energy and climate change. Stories, what are they? Well, they're among the oldest form of human communication. Stories have always played an important cultural role. They help create shared beliefs, purposes, and norms. This has been true throughout human history. A narrative is something more formal than a story. A narrative is, you could say, a constructed story. It's non-fiction. It shows some sort of development from the emergence of a problem to some sort of solution or resolution. And our basic question today is, given our current challenges such as climate change, should we reconsider what stories and narratives we tell and hold on to, and what we believe the future will hold? So I'm going to start by telling you how I arrived to this work. I was thinking there is a big, bad, dominant narrative, and we really need to change it. So a little bit about that. Now, narratives can be powerful rhetorical tools because they present one vision of reality by obscuring a lot of that reality. For example, as Cronon puts it, narrative succeeds to the extent that it hides discontinuities, ellipses, and contradictory experiences that would undermine the intended meaning of its story. So narrative has purpose. Now, today we could say that the dominant narrative, at least in the Western world, is what we call modern economic growth. This centers on technology, progress, modernity, and it appeared more or less after the Industrial Revolution. It is often portrayed as inevitable, as in there is no alternative. This is how things need to be. Barca argued that this narrative systematically silences environmental and social costs and global inequalities incorporated into current energy regimes. So this is that silencing and hiding which narratives do. Now, just to flesh this out a bit, how does this narrative work in action? So just an example from work I did a few years ago around electric vehicle futures in the UK. Electric vehicles were presented as a sustainable transport solution. Now, the economic growth narrative here was actually supported by and combined with several other stories. There's the narrative of market success, markets choosing the best option, that is. There's consumer choice, our inalienable right to choose what we want. There's technology, always portrayed as positive and as progressive. And there's automobility, that is, transport dominated by high demand, privately owned personal vehicles. So all of these together were portrayed as one story. This narrative didn't engage with other things. Unsustainability of the transport system beyond greenhouse gas emissions and perhaps air pollution, such as inequalities and so on. Now, this might be called a success story. It's compatible with incumbents' agendas, that is, car manufacturers who want to continue selling cars. It's politically more palatable than narratives of deeper systemic change. For example, questioning whether we should really be traveling as much as we do, whether we have the right to travel as much as we do. So all these stories together uphold what we call the modern economic growth narrative. And given climate change, given our other challenges, we're asking, well, is this modern economic growth narrative still fit for purpose? It narrows our options for the future. It marginalizes other stories and visions. This potentially leaves us unprepared, or at least underprepared, for the challenges we face. It limits our responses to the environmental challenges to what's called green growth. It often narrows the big questions of sustainability to greenhouse gas emissions and not other things. Now, COVID-19, we'll come back to that, highlighted deep global inequalities. So these were exposed also the fragility in our current system. And finally, something happening specifically with climate change is more and more people have firsthand experience with climate change, which means climate denialism is losing its credibility. And our business as usual narrative is not living up to its promises of solving the problem. And this has led even some climate scientists to some strong reactions. So this is, for example, Joelle Gurgis, who talked about the great unraveling. Her words, "I never thought I'd live to see the horror of planetary collapse." So given all this, does this mean our dominant narrative is ripe for change? So I'll pass over to Katie for a different perspective.
So I got started in the storytelling business a couple of years ago, and what I see is less about exclusive story and dominance and more about contrast, and it's the that stories allow us to understand two different things at the same time. So in the paper, we talk a little bit about notions of nature, both as harmonious, as represented by the Garden of Eden, and also discordant, as in a predator and prey notion. And we hold these notions simultaneously somehow, and that's one of the benefits of stories, is that actually you can see them as a bit of an ecosystem or contrast, which is not the same thing as the logic of a single narrative encompassing all things and obliterating them. Next slide. So we think about stories as multiple in this. We're introducing them as something that enables multiplicity. And it's a way of getting around just trying to crush the dominant narrative, and think about it as you would in an ecosystem, that there are predators and prey and trophic levels, and different stories do different things. And there might actually be an evolution rather than a revolution. So our scenarios and projection for future visions need this multiple stories, perspectives, and agencies. For an example, the UN Sustainable Development Goals are an example of this. There are lots of different pieces, and yes, there's some picking and choosing, but it helps create this notion of multiplicity. And there are also tensions between various goals, and that's what we're trying to work out. It's all the pieces on the playing field. Next slide. So in the work that I've done previously, I actually explicitly said that we need a system of stories. Marina Tepuzzi and I wrote a paper about telling tales, and we were looking at the built environment, but there's a life cycle that happens, and that the hero story is really good in the planning and design phase. It serves a purpose. The hero story is one where technology saves us. And so you've also heard this about the sort of new green building. The learning story, which is the next one, happens more in construction, maintenance, and operation, which is that things don't work quite as well as what they seem. And then the last piece of it is really the part that I think is underrepresented, but it's a caring story, and it's a caring for, not just caring about. It's a which is what I think we need to do with the planet right now, and it's difficult. It's gardening. It's working against entropy. And I think there's a lot that needs to happen with that. And in a building life cycle, once the building is built and is working, that's what you need to do. You need to work with it and maintain it. Next slide. So an ecosystem of stories, it goes back to this notion of multiplicity. And we're suggesting that stories coexist, compete, or even consume each other. I mean, if we're going to consider the ecosystem metaphor quite literally, and that the dominant narrative could be seen as an apex predator, but those things are not necessarily forever. I mean, we had apex predators in terms of the Tyrannosaurus Rex, and it's not around anymore because ecosystems change over time in response to perturbations and external shocks. The stories evolve to stay relevant. So for example, the evolution of green growth narrative might change the story ecosystem. Green growth is slightly getting discredited. It's still very popular, but that's what we're talking about now. Next slide.
Okay, it's back to me, I think. So an example of a perturbation, we couldn't ask for a better one than COVID-19. So as we know, systems react to shock. External shocks can generate windows of opportunity. We're talking about political shocks. This is quite well studied in political science. and was studied for the economic crisis of 2007 and 9 quite a lot, and could also be said for COVID-19. It really has been a game changer. It created incredible disruptions to our lives to fight the pandemic. Here we are online and not all together. Our lives were rearranged and a new sense of normal emerged. And it's really worth considering, what opportunities might there be? So shock as an opportunity. So early in the pandemic, we saw what we might call glimpses of another world or another way of life. There were quiet roads, there were clean air, there were pictures of the Himalaya mountains being seen from India as they hadn't been in decades and decades, with the cleaner air and so on. But now what we've seen since is a bit of a struggle between wanting to return to life as normal, that is the way it was before the pandemic, and ideas of social change, taking this opportunity to build a just world, a more sustainable world. To some extent, this mirrors the main reactions we see to climate change. And really, with the COVID reactions, economics perspectives are very relevant here. So orthodox economics is often seen as central to the modern economic growth paradigm. Now, as King said, economics is unique among the social sciences in having a single monolithic mainstream, which is either unaware or actively hostile to alternative approaches. So in what we're talking about, this suggests an active pursuit of that single story, or the reproduction of a dominant narrative. So in our ecosystem metaphor, we could say, maybe this orthodox economics, or the modern economic growth, is an apex predator, actively preying on the other stories, eliminating the competition. Or we could look at it another way as a green desert, the agricultural monoculture, grown to maximize yield and profit. However, it's not resilient in the face of shock. So COVID, in many ways, challenged the economic status quo. We know it highlighted inequalities. It also showed how our system has what's been called a fragile efficiency rather than resilience. With some supply chains disrupted, we suddenly saw various problems. We're now seeing the lack of resilience in the fact that vaccines aren't available at the same time all around the world. So some critiques have come up from heterodox economics about this. For example, Alves and Kvangraven said, in the coming months and years, there will be a battle to define the narrative of the pandemic. A fundamental change in the prevailing economic narrative is necessary for a more just, robust, and democratic society. Now, what's really interesting here is how we were talking earlier about the narrative in terms of climate change and environment. Here we're seeing critiques of the dominant narrative in terms of justice, democracy, and equality. So we think COVID adds another interesting layer to our story. And I'll pass back to Katie now.
So in conclusion, we just want to say that we lived happily ever after with our conclusions, and we think that there's a need for a plurality of stories, and how they interact with each other might be important. We're not trying to offer a specific ecosystems of stories to solve this. We're trying to evolve the idea. We are suggesting that there are tensions and interactions between the stories, and that those are valuable in promoting dialogue. There's not one solution to all sustainability problems. And an ecosystem model could help us move beyond this notion of the dominant narrative and just trying to crush it, and actually make us question the very idea of domination itself. So with that, I think we are just about at time, and we would appreciate any questions that you have. This is some further reading in case you are interested in following up on these questions of storytelling and climate change and energy research. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Perfect timing also there with the video. So we already have some questions coming in. One from Jack Pett, who says, I recently read Bregman's Humankind, which argued for cooperative man, rather than aggressive man. I wonder whether you think the economist's rational man is holding us back from changing the story to cooperative man?
Hey, Katie, do you want to take that one?
Well, again, I think if you go back to the multiplicity idea, sure. I mean, I'm not a big fan of rational man. I think that I don't think Noam is either. I think that goes back to this notion that Marlene mentioned in the last speaker, which was about, the information deficit disorder will solve, if we provide more information, people will do the right thing. So I do think that that's a story that we all believe, but may not be true, or that is sort of generally believed. So yeah, I would agree that cooperative man, cooperative human might be something that we should think about.
And there are stories around that, aren't there, in terms of maybe what's going on with the social and solidarity economy. So counter stories to the capitalist story that show cooperation and collaboration as sort of core values. Nathalie is saying thank you for your presentation. Actually, Nathalie, you're here, so you can give your question directly. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I found your presentation very interesting, especially because this year I was part of a seminar with the French Ministry of Ecology about changing the narratives. So this is right where we come up. And one of the issue was about how to change, so the Ministry of Ecology in France is very technical one, with the strong beliefs that technology will save the world. And so there was this underlying question about how to change this issue about going to a more caring and not just engineering, an engineering of care and not an engineering of solving, which is something I think that's also beyond the question of cooperation.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say that what's interesting with that is I would say that all of the data analysis that's happening now, if people are actually involved in making information out of data, they realize that takes care. It takes interpretation, and it's not magic. And so as people struggle to try and understand what is actually happening in greater detail with additional nuance, I think that part of it is actually starting to develop more relevance, at least in the industries that I study. I look at commercial real estate, and it's not getting people to care about climate change. It's about getting them to understand the systems that they're engaged in. And in commercial real estate, the business is the building. So from that perspective, I find that notion is really starting to gain some legs, and oddly with something that would seem to be otherwise hands-off, which is, the smart meter idea. So Noam, do you have?
Yeah, I just want to add one thing. I mean, first of all, I think I've spent most of my career trying to say, hey, technology alone can't save us, in different ways. But I just wanted to add that we've actually had quite a few talks even this week talking about well-being, about engaging with residents of homes to plan, to plan for better energy and so on. So I think this demonstration of what Katie called the caring for is a part of the story, is a part of the way of demonstrating how technology on its own is insufficient.
Yeah, and I would just also say that sometimes the people who are technocrats are going to be technocrats, which is why if you worry about trying to crush them and replace their narrative, maybe the time is better spent augmenting rather than replacing. And sometimes that's just a little shift in that. And I think that's what the ecosystem of stories tries to introduce, is this notion that everybody doesn't have to believe the same thing. And you work at the edge with what you can do, not with what you can't. And, slowly.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Katerina Randall is saying, well, she has many questions. says she would have many questions, maybe on WUVA, more can be posted, regarding the modern economic growth narrative. Should we focus on the narrative of green growth or degrowth, or do you think there is a plurality or multiple of stories that should coexist? I think you've just answered that there should be multiple. And then a broader question is, how do we actually go about changing the narrative?
Well, I mean, that's the big one. This is what we're trying to say,
Yeah.
is that one big shift hasn't worked so far. But I think the SDGs is a really useful example, because yes, one of them is explicitly about economic growth, number 8, if I remember correctly, but the rest are not just about economic growth, and they introduce all these other things about equality, about women's rights, about well-being, and so on. And just putting that narrative among others seems to, in the case of the SDGs, seems to be at least some way forward, as opposed to just attacking it head on, which so far we haven't done.
Right. Well, and I don't think you necessarily need to attack it. You just need to undermine it to some degree. And I think that, again, it's not going to be replaced. And the dominant narrative has some utility at this point. Dominant economic narrative, that is the way that I think that a revolution at this point would destabilize the world in such a way that it would be difficult to get anything done. So I think the question is, how do we change it over time? And I do think that there's a lot of opportunities for other narratives coming up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Maybe one last question from me, and then we'll go to the open discussion. Noam, when you were saying in your part of the presentation that or maybe I interpreted this way, that somehow the capitalist system is sort of this monoculture, but in a way, it's not, it may not be a predatory form. Economic growth may not solely be predatory, but certainly it's resilient. I mean, it seems that there is always an economic solution to everything. So in a way, isn't that why the capitalist solution has survived so well over so many ups and downs, is that somehow, climate change is upon us? Well, let's issue micro insurance to farmers in India to deal with crop failure. There always seems to be an economic solution.
Thank you. That's a really excellent question. I think that on the one hand, in terms of the system keeping going, yes, it is very resilient, as we have seen, and it can adapt, like adapting simple economic growth to green growth. But in terms of simply supplying what it promises to supply, we see less resilience, and this is what has been described as this fragile efficiency. This is the last minute supply, the last minute production, which during COVID we've seen how suddenly in different places and different times this didn't work. This is where, the big ship that was stuck in the Suez Canal caused so much chaos because there isn't an alternative system. So I think that's the differentiation.
I like that. Thanks a lot. That's really interesting, that it's about sort of the results that come. And that's why we need maybe different indicators that give us different measures of results. I'm going to try and open now to a discussion, try to group together the different papers that we've heard here today. I was thinking of Donna Haraway and how she tells us that, the stories that we use to tell stories are important. And it struck me that maybe some of your talks and presentations are sort of thinking of the elephant in the room, which is the normative dimension of why we do what we do, whether it's collective conventions around heating, whether it's expectations around civil society and how they might solve problems in places that are stripped of resources. So should there be more work on not us just talking amongst ourselves, but sort of challenging dominant narratives in research action projects? And I don't know, it's sort of a general question. And Niels Borg is saying here in the comments, is it always important to undermine or crush a narrative? Could other narratives simply become more important? Maybe that's also part of the general discussion. Are there stories that we should contest head on? For example, we should be aiming for microclimate diversity and diversity in clothing year round. Or are there stories that we should just let be and focus on more positive stories elsewhere? How do you feel about that? big question for the end of the end of the panel here.
Again, I would just say that, yes, that it has to do with our fascination with the new, and innovation, for instance. So I went to a workshop one time where they said, if we were trying to solve climate change, should we throw away everything we already have and focus only on new things? Or do we forget about innovation and just focus on what we have? And I found that to be really helpful in some ways to think through these kinds of ideas. Is that, do you believe in innovation as a solution? And I personally feel like, so the question is really, will be answered differently by different people, which is why the storytelling element is important. And I personally feel that innovation has this magic to it, which people adhere to because it's easy. It gets hard, as they say, when the rubber hits the road. When the car is actually built and you run into something, then it's no longer magic. It is a thing that needs to be fixed. And that's true with existing buildings, with existing societies, with existing clothing, but that's part of the human condition. So that's why I think I agree with Niels that you don't have to crush the dominant narrative necessarily, but introducing other ideas is important and useful. And I have found that people who want to have that introduction of something new will adhere to the opportunity to open that niche. Mm-hmm. And so that's what we want to keep, the opportunity for that niche to open. Mm-hmm. That's
I think that links to what Nathalie was saying, maybe in her question, that care is maybe one of those opportunities, isn't it? I don't know if Nathalie, Aurore, or Janine or Nadezhda, if you want to have a final comment before we close.
No, but yes, I fully agree with you, Marlene, about this question of the normative, that is really the norms that are really the elephant in the rooms, that are not really questions. And this is something that struck us also with Aurore in the study that we are undergoing right now, that the question of mobility is the key of many different issues. But what are the norms behind those issues? What are the norms behind work, behind consuming, and why do we need to move around? Is something that's not really questions.
Yeah, and that makes
Ain just presented. Ain just presented, as Noel was mentioning in his presentation, as a need. But the nature of the need is not questions, and the normative nature of the need is not questioned.
Yeah, and how it links to well-being also, to get back to the theme of the panel. What does it bring us? Any other comments from Janine, maybe? Nadezhda?
Yeah, I just have a reflection on what Katie was saying about the magic of innovation. And that I get the sense where if I was to, when I talk about clothing, if we were to reinvent clothing, and there is, wearable technologies, there is a sort of a research field within this. If it was active clothing, if we were to look at, smart clothing that we would plug in at the end of the day, I think that grabs people's attention in a way that perhaps just the clothes that we're used to wearing currently and historically doesn't. So there is definitely within the realm of clothing, there is, I think, this differentiation that it perhaps is overlooked because we're so familiar with it, we don't see it.
Absolutely, thank you. Any other comments? If not, no. So I'll just share with you some messages about what else is going on today. We have 2 informal sessions starting at 4:15, one on sound and visualization as ways of engaging with the energy system, and one on how cities' commitments have been affected by COVID-19. And don't forget, there's a party at 6 p.m. Thank you all so much. The papers will be made available via the eceee website. Marta and I will also be preparing a summary of the panel 1 discussions. We're really happy to have all of you with us today. Thanks very much, and maybe see you later.